Welcome to Fistful of Fuckery, episode 9. I know this is coming out sometime probably in beginning of May, hopefully, if everything works out with production. When this is being recorded is almost into February. So, if you're wondering how much lag time I gave myself, life happens, and I do grind a lot of hours. So, for the most part, I have to take into consideration that I'm doing this and doing other things. Because I am. So last few episodes, I know tinge on pop culture. And you're sitting there going, for the love of God, man. You gotta tell us about more films again? Are you getting money from the studio system? I'm not. But this one's no different. And oddly enough, I didn't plan this because I didn't realize the release date for it. So I know Marvel is doing the whole Daredevil, Born Again? Which is basically season 4, to my understanding of Netflix stuff. Daredevil, all of them was one I was actually relatively good. That's because the series kind of took its tone from the comic. However, I will tell you this. The comic wasn't always like that. And that's what we're going to talk about. So if you exist in the world, you don't typically read comics. I understand that. I think it's kind of sad, but I understand that. Because what you don't realize about comics, and when I introduced them to people, which is several different people throughout the years, is they're more detailed, in the pacing's different, there's a lot more diving. Again, comic books have to be respected. Despite the school, House of Un-American Activities, way back in the 50s, that whole fucking weird Red Scare shit. Comic books have to be respected because they're the longest form of narration humans have ever created. Meaning that you have page 1 back in the day of any comic book. And what happens is the stories develop. Times change on. Because what you don't realize with comics is that they control time and space. Because it's a drawn medium. They don't have to worry about actors aging out. The creative teams change up things. They keep up with the times to the best of their ability, but in all honesty, it's probably better they don't most of the time because, timelessness. But what's interesting is, I've read older books, and honestly, sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it's real hard. But what I realized growing up, again, I'm an Xer, is that the details in the comic books were made, even television shows look like a joke. Because television shows were designed, especially back in the day, as a serial structure. But not in a traditional one episode builds on another episode. Not necessarily. It's more open-ended. So a bunch of writers could write, well, we're going to write episode 3 and whatever, episode 6. And that's why you get the weird structure. There's a Bible created for the characters. You can't deviate too much from the characters unless you get the respect from either the showrunner, the editor, whoever's running the show at the time. So there's only so much they'll go. Every so often you'll have a show that will dive deeper. In the late 80s it was worse because the big American whitewash happened. So what happened is a lot of television just became squeaky clean. Class consciousness kind of got subverted. Because we're in a time of union busting and fucking everything up. So that's the thing. I said that. So, comic books have a tendency to dive deeper, get into a lot of different things. The more complicated the comic book is, which is true, the more areas you'll touch on to, right? With television, oddly enough, even some of the better shows kind of get there to a certain degree, but not as well. The only thing I can honestly compare comic book writing to would probably be maybe the first year of Westworld. That's really complicated, but first season, sorry. But the second season's terrible. The whole show falls the fuck out afterwards. But for the most part, that one season is pretty strong, right? And you compare it to something like the uncut version of Watchmen. Even the series Watchmen was pretty good because it was, that dude had to fill in for a really good writer. and to try to further a narrative along that really wasn't thought about. So when you're watching the Watchmen series, you're watching basically a sequel to the Watchmen, the comic book. And you're watching, I guess, the movie too, but the movie kind of changes it up. Any which way. Enough of that. This whole episode is kind of going to be short, not long. I figured I exhausted you guys with the first few. This is going to be about probably my favorite run of Daredevil. Again, this is going to coincide with, I think, when the season ends. And it's weird because it wasn't designed like that. When I wrote this shit on a big-ass pad, yes, it was a big-ass pad, and somebody was like, well, what are you going to talk about? I said, I don't know. So I ran ideas by a bunch of different people, and this is the one that people have read the book. So yeah, it's actually a really good thing. I don't think most people know that's a way to jump on. So even though there's probably comic book geeks in the world, or people that read comic books, this is for the people that don't. And telling you, this is actually a good venue, good medium to read. And if you want to narrow it down and not get too much into monthlies, which is costly, or too much into randomly buying stuff, I'll suggest series here and there. Like, I think season 1, I suggested Stray Bullets. Stray Bullets is non-superhero, and that HBO should be paying that dude a fuckload of money. Him and his wife a fuckload of money to do that series. That just, to me seems like a no-brainer, but that's just how it is. So which way, this is about Daredevil, and I'm going to give you some notes about Daredevil because I have them written down. So the book started back in the 60s, and Stan Lee, one of the main writers, started writing the book. And I will tell you right now, I've read the first 100 issues of Daredevil. This shit is fucking taxing. It is. It is genuinely fucking taxing. Actually, most of the Marvel books in the 60s, I know everybody's like, oh, they romanticized the idea, but the writing is so weirdly fucking spoon-fed and just over too much explanation for this shit and like just trying to make logical. It's like a neurotic, like cokehead fucking writing a bunch of random shit, right? Or anxiety disorder, whatever fucking, like, I'm hyper real. I had like 4 gallons of coffee today. Fucking, I'm on a shitter while I'm writing this stuff. It comes off like that because there's a lot of over explanation. The one thing you will take away though with earlier Marvel stuff is that their powers aren't infinite. They're not extremely strong. It's like with DC, you had Superman, and the flight thing wasn't a thing fully. Kind of, it's over time the powers get stronger. Same thing with all the Marvel characters. When they first start, they're not the way you perceive them to be, and that's why when we watch the movies, everybody's like, "Well, how come he's not able to do this? How come this is fucking year 1. This is year 2. Like, what are you doing? Like, they didn't learn this shit. It's not like they began the show where they were already in the process thereof. It's not the situation, right? So take that in consideration. So Stan Lee ran it for quite some time. Eventually, the book, I can tell you one of the major things that made the book enjoyable for me. See, again, I'll repeat this if I've already said it before. I apologize. Comic books versus cartoons. Cartoons, the idea of continuity just came out sometime in the 90s. You can thank X-Men and Batman for that. The Batman animated series from 92. They really kind of poured things in there. Prior to that, I think G.I. Joe was the only one I can honestly say that had some level of continuity. I mean, Transformers was tongue-in-cheek, but kind of, and you're like, what about Thundercats? Well, Thundercats is more of a millennial thing, but G.I. Joe existed before that. And even then, the very beginning of G.I. Joe, it's still fucking clumpy and fucking weird. Actually, the whole cartoon is. But that's why when the comic books come in, and there is a corresponding comic book for G.I. Joe from the 80s by Marvel. So that was a thing. So Gene Colan was the artist that came in, and he was basically the engine for the Daredevil. Earlier on, you have the yellow costume, and then eventually it switches over to red. His art style and his breakdowns on the page help it. And like I said to you before, cartoons have a hard time doing this. Every so often they will do it for a special, but they have a hard time changing art. usually the art is designed as uniform, and they just perfect that uniform structure. Whereas what's good about comic books is that the palette can change every so often. So you have a different aesthetic and different style. And for Daredevil, that's very important, right? So what happens is that they go on X amount of issues. Eventually, Daredevil and Black Widow become an item at some point in time. And this is like after a certain point. I can't remember. Like, they exist for a bit, and that's kind of what kept the book from not getting canceled, because Daredevil earlier on was not Daredevil as you see him in the shitty ass film that came out or the series. He was more of like a sticky, like, just another fucking superhero with a costume and a gimmick. And with that said, a lot of people could write that off. I mean, you have money spent over time. It gets exhausting. Like, really, if I'm gonna watch this, why would I watch? Why would I read this instead of reading Spider-Man, which is blowing the fuck up? Why would I read this versus whatever other book that came out at the time, right? X-Men, like even X-Men was on a cutting block at one point in time until John Byrne Claremont came in and fucked that all up. Said, no, we're gonna go this direction and made this a whole other subsection of Marvel Universe, right? So what changed Daredevil, what take him from this weird, like, hackneyed fucking superhero that, hey, look at me, I'm swinging through the air, like, I don't know. Most of it was just very hard to read. The villains were fucking weird. Was actually Marv Wolfman. He brought on the idea of, like, Bullseye. The goal to make the character more street level. The push to restructure the story, restructure the feel of the book. Frank Miller comes on and makes it more harder edge. Actually, his artwork and his material eventually creates the original Born Again, right? And that's more or less putting his Catholicism forward. Make it grittier, more, what is that called? Hard-boiled character. Now, the appeal to me with Daredevil at the time was that the hard-boiled character is a very interesting detective, right? If you're not familiar with this character, there's usually 2 or 3 variations of detectives in stories, right? There is the non-typical, right? The one that doesn't know anything about this and finds things out, right? Which I think everybody can jump onto. The hard-boiled detective, which is hired to look into shit and usually is in over their heads. And the classical detective, which is the Sherlock Holmes style detective, right? The classical detective usually just knows. Their deduction skills are fucking amazing, right? The interesting contrast between this is, if you've ever seen the movie Seven, Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt, Morgan Freeman playing the classical detective, Brad Pitt playing the hard-boiled detective. Thus, the gun gets put in his face, and all that stuff. Like, that's interesting if you think about it, right? Oddly enough, that kind of follows a similar thing. I think some versions of Sherlock Holmes has Watson in that school of thought as a hard-boiled, but not necessarily fleshed out 100%. Because usually the man of action, that's usually the situation, right? So Daredevil becomes that, right? Which I think is really interesting. Like, his skill set increases as time goes on, right? His fighting style, Stick is introduced, Elektra is introduced. You have Elektra Saga during that run. This is all volume 1. This is like issue 1 to 380. I'm not going to cover all of that. That's not what I'm doing here, right? Because my goal is to talk about volume 2. So with that, you were introduced to Bullseye, Elektra. Kingpin becomes a major focal point. In general, most of the books, like, you get this feel if you ever watch Spider-Man 92, like 93's, Spider-Man from the 90s, that Kingpin kind of unites people together to a certain degree, because the underworld under him, right, around him, is actually pretty phenomenal. Like, the New York underworld that becomes super right, to a certain degree, are like the worst versions of villains, right? You have Tombstone, you have Hammerhead, I know Spider-Man, but there's a period of time Spider-Man and Daredevil are kind of interchangeable. Like, they're dealing with two different fronts of the same character, two different parts of New York, right? So another character you're introduced to is Ben Urich, which gives you the reporter on the street. There's another run. So after Miller leaves and Wolfman leave, it kind of goes this weird tongue-in-cheek thing, random stories. Next continuity for me would be Anne Nascente, and I could be wrong by that pronunciation. Her run is when I jumped on. Now, understand, I read these other stories by Wolfman and Miller through trade paperbacks, right? That's option. They ran 32 issues, and what was interesting is John Romita Jr. became the artist. And what caught me with one of the early books I read was Daredevil on a subway cart, really thinking about the idea of, because he's blind. So he's like, was I actually in hell? Because he had to deal with Darkheart and all that stuff, right? And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, that's crazy. There's the whole notion of that, right? Her run was strong, very strong run. And it ended with the story, which wasn't hers, to my understanding, at least the best I could understand. That was the last major stories of this whole volume run was Last Rites, which I think takes place in 297 to 300, right? Which is, in a loose way, what the movie with Affleck, Ben Affleck covered. They kind of covered like 200 issues of continuity. It was fucking ridiculous, right? Like, dude, what are you doing? They're borrowing ideas from different characters. Like, Elektra was not doing the swing thing. It was somebody else. And they borrowed that. Really fucking weird. But that existed. And that storyline is similar to how the story ends at 300. And then there's another story called Fall from Grace, which takes place, I think, 316, 317, something like that. That's a good run. But then after that, Daredevil kind of goes back to being this weird fucking character that does these random shit and everything's kind of phoned in. There's no love put into the book. It's kind of like very shoddy. I remember reading it going, God, this is fucking boring, right? So stopped. I went back, collected issues over time just to put the whole set together. And I was like, okay, that's a thing. What happens is at 380, back in the day when Quesada becomes editor-in-chief of Marvel, Daredevil ends with a big-ass issue, 380. And then Volume 2 shows up a few months later. And Volume 2 kicks off probably one of the best runs of Daredevil, period. And this is the one I'm going to advise you to go read, right? Now, if you decide you want to go back to the older volume, right? I'm going to tell you this right now. Numbering with comic books have gotten fucking weird, right? Because at the end of this Volume 2 run, they go back to renumbering. So they call it 500 at some point. So in theory, it's 120 issues tacked on. So issue 121 or 500 becomes a thing. Then they have this dual numbering system on comic books, in modern comic books now. The shit is fucking weird. The management structure is probably because, and I tell you this from back in the day, that if you have like a book like Thor, because I was actually literally asked about Thor way back in the 90s. And I want to say at the time it was like maybe 300, 400 issues in. And for somebody that never read comic books before, they go to the store and like, that's 415. That's 415 issues. I'm not looking to invest in that. That's intimidating, right? So maybe the new numbering had to do with that and combined with the idea of like cash grabbing for issue ones, right? Currently, the volume system that they have kind of makes sense loosely because it's not uniform, right? But I'll give you an example. Krakoa, which is a major story in X-Men, had its end last summer. I haven't read it yet, but I know it came to a hard end. I really wasn't interested in anything to do with that storyline. I started reading the beginning of it. I'm like, this is kind of stupid. I'm like, okay, whatever. And I read X-Men from like 200, like a little before 200 up until 400 something, right? So some time in the X-Men, right? And I didn't really like it that much. I was like, okay, this is kind of interesting. Not really, but okay. Well, going back into reading X-Men was a great book called House of X. Any which way. The numbering system was designed to show different chapters of lives. So volumes now become, like when a period of time ends, a large story arc ends, it goes on to a different volume. So that kind of makes sense. It gives you another issue 1, a fresh start. Back in the day, it used to be during the summertime. Typically, they would run a large story during the summertime. So when people would ask me, hey, should I jump on this now? I said, yeah, the story is about the beginning. Like, trying to think of one. Age of Apocalypse, when Age of Apocalypse came out. And that was so crazy that was even advertised on television. So currently, actually, one storyline that's really, really big is the Absolute storylines on the DC. Not the Absolute Edition books, but the Absolute Batman, Absolute Wonder Woman. Those are big deals right now. Daredevil Volume 2 is the definitive, in my opinion, run of Daredevil. There's so much going on in this book. And the version of Daredevil in which you see, a harder edge version, more experienced version, kind of comes forth, right? And I'm going to sidebar briefly about Kevin Smith because I honestly think he was disrespected in a very interesting way because he starts this book off. He runs 8 issues, and the pacing of the story and the structure of the story and the ability for him to juggle this information shows up. Now, you already know this because you've watched some of his earlier films, and up until Red State, right? You've listened to the guy on his podcast. You're like, this guy has working knowledge. Like he's, pretty sharp, and he read comic books, so there's a love for the medium. So it shows up in Daredevil. So the first 8 episodes is called Guardian Devil, and it runs really smooth. It sets up the rest of it for the rest of the writers. I think, this is my sidebar with Kevin Smith, I think the disrespect given to him during this time is fucking crazy. Because he wrote Superman, right? What was supposed to be the Tim Burton version of Superman. And the way they treated him was like, okay, you wrote the script, we can pay you for the script, and it's not going to be made. So you're not going to be known for this, right? To my understanding, the question was in play at some point in time. And if you haven't read the question's an unusual detective story. Like somebody a little more touched that's doing the investigation, the hard investigations. Vic Sage was the first question. Renee Montoya is the current question. There is a story where one passes off to the other. It's brilliant. It was well done. So, Renee Montoya, if you didn't know, Gotham cop on DC books. To my understanding, he used to helm that. Currently, I think recently it was Howard the Duck. I'm like, this dude gets this material really well. He has a great run in Green Arrow. He reinvents Green Arrow, and all 15 issues were awesome. So he sets the tone for Volume 2. The thing that drives me nuts is that Hollywood did not utilize Kevin Smith the way they should have. You were about to have the largest dawn of comic book movies. And the problem is that I don't think they could see how popular these movies were going to be. But Marvel should have tapped Kevin Smith, if not James Gunn. Like, really. Like, this dude knows his material. And having him as a writer is just an addition, if not expansion, of what you're doing. And that's my respect to him. And it shows in this first. I was blown away. I'm like, this is what I wanted. You're giving me exactly what I wanted. So he rides up to issue 8. I'm not going to explain to you stories. Read the shit. But I'm going to explain to you, if you like the series, especially the first 3 seasons, I don't have no clue what the fuck Disney's about to give us. The first 3 seasons from Netflix, if you like that feel, this is even heavier than that. Again, comic books are more detailed. They get into more stuff. They don't fuck around. David Mack picks up in issue 9. He runs from issue 9 to 15. The idea of Echo. He does a story called Parts of a Whole. Brian Michael Bendis, which is a very important name, shows up. He does issues 16 through 19. His experience prior to that was Jinx and, oddly enough, the Sam and Twitch characters from Spawn universe. And it was funny because Sam and Twitch was more popular back in the day than Spawn. I know everybody's like, well, yeah, I live and die by Spawn. There are a whole bunch of fans with that. And hey, I didn't mind Spawn. After a while, to me, it felt like it was redundant. I was like, hey, this is boring now. But the best mainstream structures on HBO, they have the cartoon, 3 seasons. It's unapologetic, and that's what made it good, better than the film. So anyway, he did that, and then he comes on for those 3 issues. Then Bob Gale, I think the guy who did Back to the Future, he comes on from 5-issue, 6-issue run. Then Brian Michael Bendis comes back with Alex, and I'm going to say Maleev, I think it's Maleev. They take over and do this fucking run. Like, issue 26 to 81. This thing is fucking crazy. Because the style, the artist, and again, like Gene Colan, the style dictates the book. And when you change out the palette to the style and you get a good writer and they work really well together, you get something that's phenomenal, right? Like Dave McKean, I know right now currently the whole Neil Gaiman situation, but they did a long run with each other, right? You have different artists that work with different writers over time, and that changes a lot of the natures of things, right? I'm trying to think of Chris Boccello's writer from guy. He did was it Milligan? I think Peter Milligan. They did a lot of stuff together. That was really interesting. Shade the Changing Man, I cannot advise that anymore. That's equal to, in my opinion, I liked it more than Sandman, but that's neither here nor there. So anyway, so they run several issues, and they run storylines from, like I said, Kevin Smith starts with Guardian Devil, Parts of a Whole, David Mack, Wake Up with Bendis, Playing to the Camera with Bob Gale, Underboss, all the way up until the Murdoch Papers. So you have Underboss, Out, Trial of the Century, Low Life, Hardcore, Echo, the Kingpin of the King of Hell's Kitchen, the Widow, Golden Age, Decalogue, and the Murdoch Papers. And this is some of the best Daredevil you'll ever read. I mean, even understand what Frank Miller. Frank Miller had his run. He had one of the biggest stories back in the day. Because I'm telling you, Daredevil was a pretty neutral comic book for several years. And if it wasn't for Wolfman and Miller, you wouldn't have the style. This style, this is the antecedent to the style, right? So from that, you have Brubaker takes over. Him and Michael Locke do from 81 until the original return to Volume 2, which again is weird because it goes to 500, and that's really strange. But they're still working out the mechanics of that. Understand, Disney eventually bought Marvel at some point. So I know they kind of operate still differently under their own umbrella to a certain degree, but there was a, I guess, decision when it comes to marketing. I'm not necessarily begrudging that. And why I can't is because really Marvel kind of was tanked out several times. This run of Daredevil, Volume 2, and I gave you the writers because it might splinter. Mark Waid ended up writing, I think, Volume 3, and I couldn't read that shit. I had a hard time. And I'm not saying Mark Waid is not a good writer. He wrote a really good run of My Favorite Flash, Wally West, back in the day. But it was really hard to read in lieu of what just came out. You have 120 issues of just fucking amazing work. And it would be great. I'm not sure if this actually exists. They do omnibus releases every so often. And you're like, well, this shit's expensive. It is, but it's not the individual issues. And as of now, the first printed Echo, because of the series and the Marvel Universe, again, the concept of value, because Echo is really popular in the mainstream culture and the larger zeitgeist, the cost went up. So that issue alone will cost you money. And I look at it this way. If you want to read it and hand it off, which is why you get graphic novels in the first place, why you treat paperbacks in the first place, so that people can enjoy, again, tangibles versus intangibles, because you can't do that well with intangibles. If it does, it's usually fucking messy files, and nobody gives a fuck about that, and that just seems weird. Whereas if you hand off a book to somebody, they're like, the book's sitting there. It's like a fucking hard weight. They can't avoid it. So you'll usually get it back or usually get it read, one of the two. That's my experience. So if they sell this whole collection, this 120 issue collection, I advise you get a good price for it, or get it from the library, right? If you want me to read off the list to you again, I can do that. I'll wait. So Guardian Devil is the very first. Pots of a Whole. Now, there's skipped issues because I think there's single issues here and there, or 2-issue processes here and there that get included in these collections. Pots of a Whole, Wake Up, Playing to the Camera, and Underboss. Underboss is the first full-time Bendis piece, right? Out, Trial of the Century, Low Life, Hardcore, Echo, The King of Hell's Kitchen, The Widow, Golden Age, Decalogue, Murdoch Papers, The Devil and Cell Block D, The Devil Takes a Ride, To the Devil His Due, Without Fear, Cruel and Unusual, Lady Bullseye, and Return of the King. That's the full run of Volume 2 of Daredevil. And again, if you get it, whether you buy the omnibus or buy the multiple versions of it, the names you're looking for is Smith, Mack, Bendis, Gale does a run, and Brubaker. Those are the writers that kind of make this whole series work. And what's interesting is if you go to read their other works, they're really good. Again, I think Hollywood fucked up with Kevin Smith. They literally had a person that could do the Feige type of architecture, given enough time, given enough money, and given enough resources. And I think they overlooked that. If I read the actual true Superman Returns, Superman Lives version of him, the script, yeah, they did. And I don't understand the mechanics of why they do this. Again, I think their goal is to try to get shotgun effect. You know, as many people in the fucking room in the world watching their product. And I think television has fucked them up a little. But there are still films that come out, and that's why I did the last episode, because I want to make sure you were. There are great films. There's great music. Eventually, I'm going to give you a list of good albums that came out in the 21st century. Shit that is not noticed. Eventually, I will give you that, because that's the type of person I am. So anyway, which way? This sums this up. Daredevil Volume 2. If you like the show, like the material, check it out. I don't care if you pay for it or not. You can get it from the library, wherever you want to get it for. I'm not getting any fucking money for this shit. I'm just telling you, I love this run. This is a great run to read. Bye.